Hey, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
What's your name?
Wendy Stacey.
All right, and you are a professional astrologer, right?
I am
How long have you been studying astrology?
31 years now.
Wow, okay.
Since I
Uh,
was four.
and you are the head of a school of astrology here in London, right?
I am. I head up the Mayo School of Astrology.
Okay,
It's based in the UK, but it's a distance learning
okay,
and online school. So it's sort of, even though it's based here, it has students and tutors around the world.
got it. And you're also involved in one of the major local astrological organizations here?
The Astrological Association. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
and what's your role there?
I'm the chair for there, and I've been chair, I think, since 2002.
Mhm.
And I joined the organisation in 99. So, 20 years now.
Wow, you joined, so 3 years later, so you rose pretty fast through the ranks of the Astrological Association?
Yeah, I started as treasurer. So they needed someone with financial background. So that's how I sort of ended up working for them. And they wanted to look at property at the time, that sort of thing. So that sort of, I met the criteria. So I sort of started, straight into it.
Yeah. And so at some point, though, you also decided to go back to school to study astrology in like an academic setting, right?
Yeah, it was really exciting when the MA program came, when Nick Campion got the MA program running up at Bath. So I was one of I was one of the first year students there. So that was very exciting to do that.
And what did you do? Was that primarily a history program, or what was the focus?
Well, it was sort of a social science, and it sort of looked at different modules and things like that. So it was uh, looking at the history of astrology, the science of astrology, different methodologies one can use. So it was a study of astrology rather than the application of it. So, and that was in 2003. So 2002 maybe, actually, yeah. So it was a very exciting program because it was that first year. So
Oh, you were part of the first class of students.
yeah,
Wow.
yeah. So it was like going to Hogwarts, actually.
Right.
Yeah, very cool.
And you eventually completed that program, right?
Yep,
Okay.
yep. I completed that program, and and then continued and I guess I was a little bit fringe in terms of the master's program because I already had a study that I wanted to develop, a research that I wanted to develop. So the MA provided that platform for me to do so, and then I continued the study at Southampton University, and I'll possibly be transferring
Mm.
to somewhere in that area,
Okay.
Bournemouth or Plymouth or something like that.
What did your research end up focusing on, or you did a specific master, like a thesis, right?
Yeah, my master's thesis was looking at cesarean sections and the increase of those, in particular elective cesareans, and how that had a bearing on births, the natal chart.
Mhm.
And so I found that quite interesting. I mean, I'd actually started this research when I was 25, which is 26 years ago. And so I was sort of looking at that time, emergency cesarean, how that can be shown in the chart.
Mm.
And it became quite obvious. Some signatures were quite obvious when I was looking at rectification or confirming birth times, things like that. So that's how the study began. However, it sort of led more into looking at elective cesareans, so therefore births that were born between 9 and 5, Monday to Friday, and how that would impact a complete generations going forward in the astrological interpretation of the natal chart.
Right, because an emergency cesarean happens just when it needs to happen out of medical necessity, but an elective cesarean surgery usually is just something that's scheduled during normal business hours.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. And of course, over time, pretty much since about the late 80s or 1990, even the emergency cesareans are now sort of deemed emergency, even though they're conducted pre-labor.
Mm.
So, for example, twins is now considered an emergency. So it's still conducted Monday to Friday. So the stats of emergency elected, they've sort of what's the word I'm looking for really? Sorry, Chris.
That's all right. What was your background? Did you have some connection with this, or what motivated you to get into that line of research? Was it just that research project initially of emergency births and the signatures?
Yeah, so looking at emergency cesareans and looking at the birth signatures on emergency cesareans, that was what started me into this research in this area. But then, of course, as time progressed, it became really obvious that elected was born 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, and that the emergency cesareans were now being conducted as well between Monday, Friday, 9 to 5, because they were conducted pre-labour. So a breech birth or twins or something like that would be considered emergency.
So what used to be a much more random distribution of people's birth times suddenly started falling into more prescribed dates and times?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we know that births are not randomly distributed in the 24-hour day. They've historically been births more likely to occur on a Sunday or early hours or late, sort of early hours in the mornings, around like 3 to 6 a.m. And that was pretty much because women would be more relaxed on a Sunday, more relaxed at night, so we'd go into labour. So there was always a peak in terms of births at those times and days, but that, of course, has now changed.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you have data going back. I mean, how far does the data go back that you're able to look at when it comes to studying the earlier history of this prior to cesareans becoming more common? Like early 20th century data, or?
Yes, well, we didn't really have much data on cesarean births at all, to be honest. Most studies done sort of removed intervened births. So there was a study in 1970 done by Chamberlain, and he saw an increase sort of in cesareans. And of course, this is what Michel Coquelin was concerned about. He was concerned about the increasing number of cesareans and what that would do in terms of cosmic imprint.
Why was that? Why was he concerned?
Well, he was concerned that babies born through intervention would not have the cosmic imprint. He was challenged by Jeffrey Dean, and Jeffrey Dean said, well, if that's the case, then astrology doesn't work. So Coquelin backtracked and said, yes, the cosmic imprint is there. However, the genetic factors are missing. That was Coquelin's findings for cesarean birth. And that was, in the 70s. But we're talking really about 1 to 2% back then of all births.
So very low.
Very low. And, some births need to be born by cesarean. I mean, the World Health Organization thinks that between 10 to 15%, and certainly in countries like Africa, that is needed, where infant mortality is really high. So there is a need for those sort of surgeries.
And is that part of the reason why infant mortality and like the mother's mortality used to be so high prior to modern times?
Yeah. I mean, cesarean section is an amazing surgery. It's wonderful, but it's sort of just been exploited in the last couple of decades. Like, for example, in 1990, the average age of mother was 24.9 years.
Okay.
Now it's around 29.5.
Okay.
But what's fascinating about that figure in 1990 is if you take 24.9 years from 1990, you end up smack bang in the middle of the Uranus-Pluto conjunction in the 60s.
Wow.
So you have this generation that in Virgo who worked longer. They worked longer. So mothers started to become older when they have their firstborn. And so this is where the pattern starts to... And of course, to also say, this is during the time where the, stellium and Capricorn generation well, the stellium, the Saturn, Uranus, Neptune in Capricorn was around. So there was a lot of control around birth as well. So these sort of factors played into why cesarean births, well, one of the reasons why cesarean births became increased over time, gradually.
So it took off. It was 1% to 2% many years ago, but what is it at this point?
Well, it differs between different locations. Cities like London, Rome, New York, Sydney have probably about a 27% cesarean section rate at the moment.
Wow.
Yeah, and the elected, well, and it's very difficult to differentiate between elected and emergency. You know, they don't categorize it in post and pre-labor, which is what they used to do. So, but the majority, you know, at least probably 15 to 17%, well, of all births are elected. So, and then you've got the emergency on top of that. But of course now people think, you know, spontaneous births, with spontaneous births, even they're being born Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, due to intervening practices such as inducing a woman at midnight so she will go into labour and have the baby in the morning. So there's a design of, you know, a pattern that's just increasing. So, you know, and the same with any other intervention with ventouses or forceps or something like that. These babies are increasingly being born Monday to Friday, 9 to 5.
Okay, because that's when the doctors are working.
Yeah.
Yeah, versus they take the weekend off.
Yeah.
Right.
When I did my pilot study at Bath Spa for my MA, I did a pilot study and I looked at 193 births. But, you know, the variables were a little bit... I didn't really look at age or socioeconomic background. You know, I didn't look at many factors that I, you know, have since... I have looked at since. But what was fascinating is looking at these births, it became very clear that there were, because most of these babies are born 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, it became clear that there was very little ninth house sons, which sort of indicates obstetrician's lunch hours.
Okay.
And then when you sort of put it into Monday to Friday, sort of Friday afternoon was a little bit, you know, absent as well. So from that, you could sort of deduce that obstetricians' golfing practices and lunch hours, have a bearing on when babies are born.
Or like affecting people's destinies and things like that.
Well, yeah, because I was really interested to know what astrologers think, and it sort of questioned my views on fate, actually. So I did a survey at a conference of over 200 astrologers, and it's quite interesting how many astrologers believe that a baby is born at a time that it should be, or at a time that it wants to be. Yet, when you look at these stats of babies not being born at lunch hours or Friday afternoons, you sort of think, well, actually, there's, you know, it challenged my own views, and I realised that, obstetricians' diaries are not an advocate for fate.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right. And going back to Coquelin, isn't one of the claims that he made at one point, at least, that he thought the Mars effect and other similar planetary effects disappeared if the birth was induced or something like that?
No, well, Coquelin, you know, he looked at the occupations and he looked at hereditary factors, and so it didn't make any difference with occupations. But of course, what it did do is, which he wouldn't have looked at the time because it wasn't happening Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 when Coquelin was around. So he never sort of ever touched on that because elected cesareans weren't around. But he found that any birth born 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, would have a predisposition to have the Sun, Mercury, and Venus in 2 of the Coquelin plus zones. So either near the midheaven or near the ascendant. But of course, he didn't look at Venus, and he didn't look at the Sun. He didn't look at Mercury, and he didn't look at the Sun. And he only looked at... So what he So what you can take from this group of people is that they have there's a majority with Venus in these plus zones. So therefore, we can explore the Coquelin traits. However, when he said that there's an intervention in birth, he believed that the genetic factor was lost. I'm in sort of two minds about that, because I think, on one hand, yes, and I can understand why he would say that, in terms of a baby coming when, to be born. And when a baby is born, you can see the genetic factors, astrological genetic factors with the rest of the family. However, I think when you look at adopted children, or when you look at people who have cats and dogs, all those astrological signatures still bear the same family characteristics.
Right.
So I'm not convinced that, he's. I don't necessarily agree with him on that one.
Sure, he was coming at it from more of like a biological standpoint or something, or thinking there was a physical biological mechanism for astrology.
Yeah, well, he said things like, so if someone had Mars rising, then their child would have a probability of having that as well. If both parents had that, then the probability would be, doubled. And he looked at things like that, and that's possibly the case. But I guess I've seen too many adopted children sharing those factors with their parents and siblings. So I would need to see more evidence to really agree with him, I think, on that one.
So that's what you meant by hereditary factors, is those carryovers from the parent's chart to the child's chart. He said those were lost when the birth was induced?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what he said, but I'm not,
Yeah, which may not be true, but he was wrestling with different ways that his data was being interpreted and trying to defend it to show that there was still some sort of astrological statistical correlation.
Yeah, exactly. But of course, also the Coquelin character traits would still apply to this sort of study in terms of looking at Venus in those plus zones. So you're looking at a generation or generations of a population where they have where the majority of them have Venus in those plus zones.
Okay.
Which he would say that this generation would be more charming and affable and agreeable and pleasing, and they would have an absence of the Mars quality. That's what he would say. So he would look at a generation and say they don't have any of these Mars qualities. Because of the Venus in the plus zone. That's what, yeah.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that. What are some of in terms of charts, what are some of the implications if astrologically, not in terms of interpretation, but just in terms of chart placements, if more people are being born Monday through Friday between 9 to 5?
Yeah, so you get a higher probability of having sun. You have sun, of course, between the 9th and 8th, the 12th and 8th house.
Okay, so top half of the chart?
The top part of the chart, yeah.
Okay.
And because of the Mercury and Venus being so close to the sun, you also have a higher probability of them also being in the top part of the chart as well.
Okay.
Hence the Venus being in the plus zones. So yeah, you have these three, with the Sun, Mercury, Venus being in the top part of the chart for a huge amount of the population. When it's probably over 60% when you look at the amount of births that would be randomly distributed. When you factor in the cesarean sections, there's a really high percentage of children being born Monday to Friday, 9 to 5.
Wow. So it's throwing off the distribution of what it would have been naturally a century ago.
Yeah.
And suddenly we're dealing with something else where, astrologers seeing clients are going to see a much higher proportion of certain types of chart placements just as a result of this human intervention that's taking place.
Yeah. Would account for a lot, there's a lot to be said about millennials and different generations having this. It's, I mean, as astrologers, there's nothing wrong with having Sun, Mercury, and Venus in the top part of the chart, but there's something very interesting when a whole population around the world has this. It's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And sorry, you asked me before about where this, and I was telling around the world. I mean, places like Brazil have a 75% cesarean section rate.
Oh, wow.
Places like Shanghai and Madras, which up until a decade ago was the only places in India and China that recorded method of delivery. Both have about a 45% cesarean section rate.
Wow.
That's perhaps because there's they want to choose their day, or they're looking for auspicious days.
Right.
So China and India have that.
In China and India, because astrology is still much more popular and part of the popular culture, sometimes there's specific years where everybody will try to have a child during that year.
Yeah, or on the 8s and, the times and all that. If they can have a cesarean, they'll have it at a time that they feel is auspicious. So that's a little bit concerning, as because it's part of a baby design, really. It's, so that is concerning. And then there's places like Holland that have about we're talking about a decade ago, they probably had about 3 to 5% cesarean section rate, and that's because they have a strong midwifery-led childbirth practices. So, so where you have that, there's many different factors why there's different rates in different places. But yeah, it's and it's still increasing, and I'm just trying to think of, I think it's Nick Frisk of Queen Charlotte Hospital here. He is in favour of having 100% cesarean section society.
Just because it's safer for both the mother and the child, or?
Well, that's one of because that's often what it's promoted to do, but that's actually not correct, because it's not safer for mother and child. But he finds that, women giving birth spontaneous is archaic. That was his words, is archaic. So, it's a little bit worrying when you've got someone who's the head of the biggest training hospital in the UK advocating for promoting 100% cesarean society.
So what are some of the other reasons that mothers are electing cesareans more often? Because there's some different motivations for that, right?
There's many. In Brazil, it's often through sexual reasons, the diminished sexual experience. So taking a baby out of the stomach is preferred. There's financial incentives for obstetricians. They get paid more to do that because it's high risk. There's also sort of the male to the obstetrician to midwifery ratio. And the assessment of risk is an interesting one, because where, for example, twins are considered an emergency, that's because the risk is not actually giving birth to twins. The risk is because the obstetrician has no training in that. If you met a 70-year-old obstetrician in Lebanon, they've probably delivered thousands of twins, and that wouldn't be a reason for having a cesarean. So it's the lack of experience and education, and for obstetricians that happens. There's also fashion has a lot to do with birth. The Sun King of France wanted to see his mistress give birth, so there is a painting of him with a blanket over his head, watching his child being born. And his mistress is lying down. And because of that painting, women give birth lying down, because what happened is that painting became famous, it became very elitist, and women all around the world wanted to lie down and give birth. most women before that would have stood up, kneeled, got on all fours, or whatever one needs to do in terms of gravity to make, to ease of childbirth. But this painting created such a fashion that, Chris, probably you and I were born for. That's a consequence of the fashion that stemmed from that painting.
Mm. And that's like they've said that that's a more difficult way to give childbirth, or even more dangerous in some instances, right?
But still, women give birth every day lying down, which is not the best way to, And, a lot of that is through other intervention because they've got TENS machines strapped to them, they've got catheters, they've got this, that, and being monitored. And, so the spontaneous natural birth is quite a lot different than what it used to be.
Mm-hmm. Sure. And in terms of that, I'm trying to think, because there's other debates, of course, classically with astrologers, like what is the moment of birth, or when do you count the beginning of a person's life, and things like that, right?
Sure. I mean, I've always said it's the first breath, and that's because it's when the umbilical cord stops operating between baby and mother. So up until the baby takes the first breath, it's dependent on the mother's oxygen through that, through the cord. So as soon as it breathes, it becomes independent of the mother. So I've always said that, but I guess some people may say as soon as it enters the world, really. But it still is dependent on the mother until it takes that first breath.
Right. Just that question of, is it the emergence or is it the first breath, and what constitutes independent life?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes, quite.
What are some of the details surrounding that? Because I've heard, and I'm asking, it's a little off topic, but there's sometimes like delays between those two, right? Or there can be like a little bit of a delay between.
Well, there can be, and more and in particular with cesarean sections, because every cesarean section that's performed is a premature birth. And the problem with any premature birth is that it has a higher risk of respiratory problems.
Okay.
And so therefore, yes, there may be a delay, but, and there's often a machine involved and things like that. Because often these babies can be very premature because, people don't always get the dates correct. They're 40 weeks, or the gestation period of pregnancy around the world is sort of 40 weeks, but that was actually based on a Caribbean study. If you find different cultures, like, for example, Indian culture, the gestation period is a lot shorter by a couple of weeks. So that does play into when a baby could first take its first breath. Yes. And that's one of the reasons why it's higher risk as well, cesarean, as opposed to spontaneous.
All right. So we've talked a little bit about interpretation and about how this tendency to have the births between 9 to 5 will add an increased tendency for like the Sun and Mercury and Venus to be in the top half of the chart. But there's actually some other implications to this as well, right? In terms of chart placements?
Absolutely. Well, when you have Sun, Mercury, Venus in the top part of the chart, you don't have any Sun, Mercury, Venus in the bottom. So there's no, but apart from that as well, there's no nocturnal charts. So it's going to be rare to have a Pisces with Scorpio rising, or a Capricorn with Libra rising. You're not these sort of Sun ascendant combinations are declining, if not quite significantly already. So even just doing a study on nocturnal and diurnal charts would be interesting. But of course, that has massive consequences in astrological interpretation. In terms of rulerships, even nocturnal. Like looking at a nocturnal chart, they're all going to be diurnal. So the rulerships and the absence of it's more just the absence of things as well, which we need to sort of acknowledge, I guess, because there's a really sort of balance problem here.
Right. Things suddenly they go from being more balanced to being extremely imbalanced in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you think of, the Sun, Mercury, Venus in the top part of the chart, and you think, I sort of see this now. I didn't see it in 2003, of course, But what I see now is, this is the generation that's very out there, and this is social media. The 10th house is this. There's a is very prominent in these births. So the 10th house status, and this generation is very much about how many likes it gets, how popular it is, and that's the status. It's changed. I mean, I understand the Capricorn generation sort of feeds into that as well, but it's interesting that, and the Venus as well, Mercury. So I think perhaps on a much more sociological perspective, we need to look at this and see where it's going, and how serious is it really?
Right. So you feel like this many people having birth charts with this greater tendency to certain placements is really going to have a larger societal effect in terms of when those people grow up and go into the world being a slightly different place as a result of the perspective they're bringing to things.
Yeah, it's not good or bad. It's not good or bad, but it is concerning where there is such an imbalance of this. There's nothing wrong with these people, but when you have a culture, a whole globe, global society that has this imbalance, what does that mean in terms of assessing culture, where it's going? And what is it, how is it going to change? So I think, my background's in sociology, so I have I constantly think of where this may lead for the future, not just in astrology. Astrology gives us a tool to understand it, actually, because from a doctor's point of view, obstetrician's point of view, it doesn't really matter.
Right.
But from our point of view as astrologers, it really, really does.
Yeah, and I don't think we've ever seen something like that where there's been that big of a societal shift in terms of astrology and so many people being born in a way that's so much different than at any other time.
It's unprecedented in human society. This has never happened. Because and of course it's technology as well. That's another factor. Technology has created the means for us to do this, and it's about efficiency and time, and that sort of thing. So that has a bearing on and so it's only going to increase. And technologies, and also a big concern I have is with the technologies. Like, a lot of the younger generation don't want to give birth anymore. They actually don't want to. And that's quite concerning. And I can't help visualize, I can't help wonder where that's going to go in terms of if people don't want to give birth anymore. Well, two things. If they don't want to give birth anymore, then there's no need to carry a baby, and there's no need to have sex to conceive one. But also, and already we can see the signs of this. Like Japan, there was a study a couple of years ago where people between 18 and 40, 50% hadn't had sex in 2 years. So this is where it's perhaps going as well. But the other side of it too is, if we don't want to give birth, then we don't need to carry babies within ourselves, women. So we're almost creating the demand for a technology to have these babies, to procreate in quite a different way. And I can't help visualizing the Matrix,
Right.
And all these pods or something along those lines, because that is where it's going to go. And it's, unfortunately, sci-fi writers will determine our future on many levels. So I think there's a concern for actually procreation, across the board here. This is a way of ousting it almost.
Yeah, I mean, that raises an interesting question of, if you did have a completely artificial birth, do you still have like a birth chart and a birth time? And is natal astrology still going to work the same way at that point?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. Yeah, because when does it birth?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And what does it mean? There's a wonderful study done by a Dr. Arthur Janoff, and he wrote a book called The Primal Scream. and he worked a lot with Stanislav Grof. And he looks at how babies born naturally arrive in the world where they are equipped. They've had an intense survival experience, and they've learned to have the drive and the need to be birthed. And he's very concerned about when human beings don't have that, then they don't have that drive. They don't have that survival technique, really, that humans are born with. So there's a different angle, but from that point of view. But there's many consequences that I don't think we even know at this point.
Yeah, well, it raises a lot of questions since astrologers often debate like how astrology works and what the basis is of why a birth chart says anything about a person's life, and to what extent there is a biological component or other components that are tied in with either the gestation or the moment of birth that are relevant in explaining the astrological effect or whatever that is.
Yes, well, exactly. And we may end up starting to think about conception, those sort of things, which are, we can't determine at this point. We're unable to do that unless it's outside of the body.
Could you expand on that? Why can't you determine conception?
Because sperm can live up to 7 days.
Okay.
So I guess you could do it if you were monitoring it, but if you do it in a dish, you can see when conception starts, I guess.
Right.
So that makes it easy to determine with conception, and it would be very interesting. I would be very interested to know when conception takes place.
Right.
But I wouldn't want the technology intervening. But if we are not going to be giving birth in the same way, which I believe we won't be at all, we will not be having natural births in 30 years' time, unless by accident. It'll be by accident that happens. But it will be, then when a baby is going to be born, if it is outside the womb, will be an interesting thing to. How is it? It will be birthed at a time when we believe that the gestation period is ended.
Okay.
But I don't know how that will play into astrology, which I think perhaps why we would be more interested in conception perhaps at that stage.
Sure. So that was interesting. So you said, I'd heard that before, but maybe some listeners haven't, that conception can happen up to like 7 days after like intercourse, basically, right?
Yeah,
so
because sperm can stay alive up to that time. So,
okay.
We never really know exactly when an egg is fertilized. Exactly, we don't know.
Right. It's just interesting because astrologers have sometimes debated that, like the birth chart versus the conception chart, and some ancient astrologers had conception charts, but they seem to just rectify it for however they did that.
Right. Yeah, there used to be the what is the name of the there is a study done which doesn't really hold up, to be honest. I can't remember it now. Sorry, Chris.
That's okay.
It will come to me. But yeah, based on the moon's longitude and things like that, it will come to me during this session. But it doesn't hold up. But it is the only astrological theory or research done on that subject. But it doesn't hold up in northern latitudes, and it doesn't hold up for twins.
Okay.
So it doesn't really work as far as I'm concerned. But
right. So you said that you think it's going in that direction, so that at some point in the future, this is going to be like 100%. Is that aside from accidents, or?
Wow, yeah, that's what the head of Queen Charlotte wants, which is the biggest training hospital probably in Europe, really, or certainly one of the, largest. And if the head of, and there's many women obstetricians as well. I mean, when you go back to that Uranus-Pluto conjunction in Virgo, which I am one of, there's a lot of people have attributed cesarean section and the baby conveyor belt sort of thing to men. A lot of feminists discuss sort of that men are controlling women and birth and that sort of thing. And to a certain extent it is. But what I found fascinating, because I interviewed a lot of mothers who'd given birth by cesarean section, and the ones of my generation, the ones with Uranus, Pluto and Virgo, when I interviewed them, the narrative that came from these women were, I wanted to know everyone was doing their job. I wanted to make sure that the clinic was sterile. I wanted to make sure this and that and this and that. And basically it became very clear that these women wanted to organise their birth.
Okay.
It's a Virgo thing.
Sure.
So Uranus, Pluto and Virgo, even wanting to know the sex of a baby is partly because of organising after their birth. It's a very Virgo thing. And it doesn't matter what it is as long as it's healthy. It's very Virgo, but they do know what, these women did want to know, because it's all about organisation. So it's not always about control. It's actually just about organising, I think.
Okay.
And I think that's paved the way, of no return. And it's not just that generation of mothers, it's the fathers, the health professionals. So everyone's sort of all on the same wavelength, if you like, a mindset of an organised birth is a good one.
Okay. And you said that sometimes there's like an aesthetic component, just as there's been a rise in plastic surgery and things like that. That's a component or contributing factor for some people.
Oh yeah, the aesthetics of it, yeah, very much so. In terms of for example, Brazil with diminished sexual experience. I mean, that's there's that, and yeah, there's a disconnection with the reproductive organs as well. I mean, some women, some men have said that after they've watched birth, that they, find it difficult to see a woman's parts as a sexual organ after that. After it, so there is a lot of aesthetic, but that's what it is. It's it's a sexual organ. It's for procreation, giving birth. But so there's a real disconnect from that.
Sure.
And that's very it's very strange.
One other thing we haven't touched on yet is that if it's all happening Monday through Friday, then the planetary weekdays sort of thing sort of gets blown out of the water a little bit as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be honest, most of the births are done earlier in the morning.
Okay.
And Monday to Thursday. So less on Fridays, and that's So. And of course, Christmas, Boxing Day, Easter, bank holidays, really low rates of birth during those holiday periods.
That's so funny. So there would be certain degrees of the zodiac with the sun that would just be blocked out, or would just be much lower for different age groups. Like Christmas Day, I'm trying to think of, that's sun is
Capricorn.
Yeah, Capricorn. Yeah. So we won't have any of that degree of Capricorn births, or at least they'll be much more rare.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's always been certain peaks, particularly around September. It's sort of a post New Year's Eve thing. And there's actually been some interesting studies on baby boomers. America had a big baby boom, or a mini baby boom, I should say, after, the power cut of New York for 7 hours. Things like that.
What happened with that?
So I think it was in the late 70s. I may be wrong on that, but the power went out for 7 hours. People trapped in elevators and everything. And there was a mini baby boom after that, 9 months after that.
Okay.
And so I sort of explored these sort of types of research. What I found a little bit disheartening was I went to Massey University in New Zealand, and one of the guys there did a study on little mini baby booms in New Zealand, because no one could work out why there was these peaks and troughs over a certain amount of decades. But this particular researcher nailed it, and he found that they were associated with All Black wins.
Okay.
So when the All Blacks won rugby, in an international game. 9 months later, there'd be a baby boom. So I thought that was, but yeah.
Yeah, well, that's really funny just how different societal, just going back to the societal thing, how little things like that can sometimes have like a huge generational impact in this clustering of people born at the same time.
Yeah. Well, and of course, we've also got China, who has a predominantly male society, one-child family. So, and things like sociologically, when you've got a population of mostly men, then it's been, quite often that leads to war. When you've got a very margin population, and so we're living in some very interesting times right now, and this generation. It would be interesting how it plays out. I think it's going to be.
Yeah. Are there any other interesting ones like that in terms of holidays? Like in the US, sometimes they talk about like Valentine's Day and
Sure.
yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So there's seasonal too. There's like seasonal births. For example, northern latitudes where where it's winter for 6 months and summer for 6 months. There's less births because women actually don't menstruate as much either, so they're not as fertile when there's no moon, when there's no when they're living in the dark for 6 months. So there's a lot less births from that. So that's, and I think that applies to all northern latitudes where it's dark, so there's seasonal things with birth too. But then there's always been these patterns. There has always been these patterns. And I would imagine even the lunar phase would actually play into that too.
Sure, in terms of like how bright it is outside at night versus how dark it is.
Yeah, and well, and also on a different level, like there's lots of studies done in psychiatric units. I think the book The Moon and Madness is an excellent book written by a psychiatric nurse who did an overall study of all that had been researched on full moons and hospitals. So from A&E to cardio departments to psychiatric, and he found behaviour different. So I think that would play into that as well. Perhaps also looking at emergency cesareans because it's more crisis orientated, I think.
Right. How did this research? So when you went into this, I'm sure you found some things that were unexpected that you didn't expect to find. How did that affect your views on astrology in general? I mean, did even just doing this research, because I don't think a lot of astrologers focus on statistical research, for example, or like look into hard numbers.
Yeah, and I'm not a statistician by any means. I'm much more for qualitative, but I use both. I think mixed methodologies, and well, but you need the numbers to understand. I would be interested to know how many, just even nocturnal, diurnal, people within the last 2 generations,
Right.
last 2 decades. And I think you'll find there's a, huge discrepancy between that.
Right.
But it's very difficult to get that data. I was very lucky to get the data that I did. I looked at 90,000 births.
Wow.
From the 4 Bristol hospitals. And I was very lucky that the company gave me the data and I got mother's age, and method of delivery, exact time of delivery, and that sort of thing. So I explored 90,000 data, and of all births over 18 years. So it was the statistics on that is just incredible, and it's not sophisticated. It's very easy. It's all done in Excel. So it's very easy to do. But I mean, just looking at how many cesareans are born, at 9 a.m.
Right.
There's just off the scale peak, and we need those in order to understand what's going on. But I'm not a stats person at all.
Sure.
But this is more about number counting.
Yeah, but it's important that, I'm sure it's something that was new to you just because it's not something that astrologers usually do a lot of, and at least insightful in seeing that sometimes, certain patterns are the result of, outside intervention, or things that can be explained, that you have to be careful to take those like sociological explanations into account
Yeah.
instead of immediately jumping to maybe some other astrological conclusion or something like that?
Well, absolutely. And I wouldn't have actually thought about the Uranus, Pluto, and Virgo generation,
Mm,
even though I'm one of them, had I not interviewed women and heard them just using all these Virgo keywords,
right.
which made me think, I never ever thought that's where it was going to lead.
Mm,
So, and I'm quite happy to, this is very, it's just not, sort of, it's organic for me. I'm happy to go wherever it takes me, and I don't have any in particular direction I want the research to go.
mhm.
I would be more interested in looking at what has not been done. There's only one study ever been done on looking at the effects of cesarean section from a psychological point of view. I think that was more about emergency. And as astrologers, we'd probably agree. And it was a very small study done on children and how they may, and as they're young, how they perceive the world.
Mm,
And I mean, just as this is very brief, and it's not, this is not a blanket interpretation, but, for example, if someone had Pluto on the ascendant,
mm,
my question is, what was your birth like? And the psychological traits that go with Pluto on the ascendant correlate with the study that's been done on children that were born by cesarean. So I'd be interested in looking at a social psychological, to see, how that actually, because it's a pretty traumatic experience, but in a different way than people had been born before.
right. That makes sense. So, one of the things that we started talking about a little bit, and we've touched on a few times, is just generational changes and some of those transits. But there's some transits coming up to, you really focused on the Pluto and Virgo generation, and then how there were some babies and some things coming in during that Capricorn stellium in the late 80s and early 90s. But now there was some transits coming up to that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that particular generation is now coming of age for first child
Mm,
age. So that's roughly the 30 years. So, which is the age of mother at first birth today. So yes, they are coming up to that age, and they're being hit with the Saturn Pluto conjunction in Capricorn, followed by Jupiter later this year. And so I think that's going to have a bearing on terms of Capricorn is a parental sign.
mm,
So I think there's going to be quite a lot of interest in how to change childbirth as it currently stands in a natural form.
mhm,
It's going to challenge the status quo
mhm.
that's out there. And there is a breakdown of the nuclear family. This is a generation where it was normal for parents to be divorced, have up to 8 grandparents. So that whole nuclear family is sort of broken up anyway. There's less children being born within families, no children being born. So we're already on a path of, changing family and childbirth.
Mhm.
And as Jupiter starting to go into Aquarius next year, followed by Pluto, it's going to bring in quite radical ways of childbirth, I think. Aquarius is not, doesn't, really, Aquarius, prefers being with like-minded people than with blood relations,
Mm.
or with humans at all. No, but so I think that the technology that's going to be introduced with that, and the uniformity of birth in quite a different way, is going to, and I think it's going to move very fast.
Mm.
Very fast. I mean, we've moved a long way in 2 decades.
Right.
When all these three planets move into Aquarius, it's going to spearhead us into something quite unprecedented and irreversible.
Yeah, it's interesting thinking about the age of Aquarius as and the way technology obviously has suddenly and very rapidly come into everybody's lives. But it's interesting thinking about it affecting something so fundamental like this, like when people are born, and creating greater uniformity in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, this is a generation, part of other research I do is looking at this particular generation with the stellium and Capricorn and the incredible amount of anxiety that comes with that generation. Capricorn is anxiety.
Mhm.
And I worry about this generation. I think it's been left to sort of raise itself, if you like, and had to create its own regulations and things like that, particularly with social media.
Mhm.
So I think the anxiety around childbirth, I think there's going to be a real disdain for it. And the anxiety of pregnancy and childbirth may be the catalyst in creating technologies to avoid carrying babies and giving birth.
Sure. And do you feel like, I mean, with some of these things, especially like aesthetic trends, sort of wax and wane in different years and different generations from decade to decade, like maybe, and this will be something where it's a trend, but perhaps sometimes there might be a counter trend at some point so that it
Sure.
maybe doesn't go as far as it could, even though it's on that trajectory now.
Sure. Well, the other side of the Aquarius, of course, is more the going, being a little bit more um, mindful of uh, the
Yeah.
is being more mindful of humane, more humane practices, that sort of thing. So that may be the other side to that.
Hmm.
And of course, the shadow side to Aquarius is Leo. And whenever I talk about this, I always put on Bonhoeffer's quote that says, "The measure of a society is how it leaves it for its children."
Right.
And because I always feel that it may be the children in this particular era that we're living in that will not be counted,
Mm.
will not be valued. And yeah, we do not know what we do, really. We
Sure.
don't have the facts. We don't know what the implications of this particular method of delivery
Hmm.
has psychologically. We can see it sort of culturally, sociologically, but psychologically, we don't have that information.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny because it's one of those interesting problems that we're sort of seeing the beginning of it in many ways now, but it's something that astrologers will have to deal with in the future. That's almost not fully our problem yet, but we can sort of see that it may be at some point. Like astrologers often get the question of like what happens when people are born on the moon or Mars or something, and can you still do astrology there? And it's sort of like an interesting thought experiment, but it's really something that future generations are going to have to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. Even space stations and things like that,
Right.
creating new coordinates for everything, and yeah, exactly. So, yeah, it would. And that's not unrealistic. I mean,
Right.
NASA's been planning that since the 70s, and
Right.
if we need to have space stations and that cater for populations, it's not at all to think that this is not going to happen in the next decade.
Mhm.
There's also, with the Aquarius, the Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto in Aquarius, it's going to be quite a different world. It's going to be quite a different world, and particularly, technologically and that sort of thing. So I think children are going to have to, because of the Capricorn generation and going into Aquarius, I think they're going to have to grow up a lot faster.
Mhm.
I mean, one thing that concerns me, it's a little bit way out there, but Ray Kurzweil, who writes about the singularity,
Mhm.
the American he's advisor to 3 presidents, and he's got 13 honorary PhDs from Ivy League universities. And he believes we will be able to download the brain within a couple of years. He said by the late 20s.
Mhm.
And what he means by that is personality, skills, memory. And if we're able to do that, then we'll also be able to upload the brain as well.
Mm.
And what that means for child development, when you can upload to a 2-year-old every language in the world, engineering, this is really so close now. It's not even, far-fetched. 10 years ago it would have been, but it's already happening.
Sure.
You
Yeah,
know.
well, that makes me think also of like the movie Gattaca from the 90s, where they had people picking like biological traits and trying to eradicate biologically like imperfections or things like that, like genetically inherited disease. But we kind of are like astrologically with some astrologers doing like electional astrology for births
Yeah,
that gets tied into. You're not a fan of that?
well, if they have to have a cesarean, then fine. But
Sure.
there's no good or bad
Mhm.
chart. There's nothing. You don't ever look at a child and go, "Oh, that's terrible."
Right.
And
Yeah.
you can't put a child back in either.
Right.
So it becomes very judgmental. It becomes too black and white. When I have elected a chart for a friend.
Okay.
And she was about 46 when she had to have a cesarean. And she had that because of a blood transfusion she'd had several years ago. But then, with all elections, sometimes it's not within your hands.
Right.
Um, and it was fine. But I think, you, if you have to, if there is going to be, it's a bit like having any operation, really.
Hmm.
But I would do it more about the operation rather than try to design the perfect baby.
Okay.
Because this is a problem. I've had a quote on my fridge for about 15 years, and it's from The Economist, and it says, the Smiths told the Jones how much they'd paid to have their daughter to have blue eyes. And the Jones couldn't believe it. They thought, why didn't they put that money to making her more musical? And it's been on my, and this is how it is now. And we do this now. For example, you can have an abortion up to 24 weeks due to unfavourable results, paper results. So yet you can have a baby and it can survive at 22. So we're all sort of getting into these sort of very weird grey areas that we're not, where it's going to test our morality, I think, a little bit more. And the Aquarius will hopefully do that. Their planet's moving into Aquarius will, shift our moral compass, I believe.
Sure. Well, and it seems like that'll be a challenge ethically for astrologers then if the induced birth and scheduled birth rates do go that high, like astrologers are going to get that question much more often, it would seem like, because clients will naturally then say, well, if I need to schedule it, when should I schedule it? And what things should I take into account?
Yeah.
Do you think if it went up to that high of a rate, does it become less of an ethical issue at that point, or at what point is it, something where you would feel comfortable?
I think that will be normal. Well, it's going on now in China and India.
Sure.
It's already happening.
Right.
And we just don't have it here yet, so it's going to happen.
I mean, how much of that is a natural outgrowth of astrology that's acceptable in some sense versus how much is that philosophically like I don't want to go so far as to say a misuse of astrology, but is it problematic?
Well, that's questionable, isn't it?
Sure.
Yeah. To what extent? Yeah. To what extent do you? Well, it's. I guess with astrologers, we sort of as we train, where we learn about having a strong conscience and a high moral benchmarks. But there's still people that sort of elect terrible things. And they used to all the time, of course. That's when they would elect battles and wars and so I guess it's not new for us, but we haven't sort of lived by the same parameters in the last 100 years, perhaps, or 70 years. But I don't know. I think it will definitely. I mean, it's already happening in places like China and India, trying to find auspicious times to have a child when it's within their when they're able to do so. But it will come to the Western world too, and it's going to bring up a lot of questionable practices for astrologers. Some people will think there's nothing wrong with it. yeah, not sure I'm
So
ready for
where,
that yet.
sure, yeah, the future is always very strange. Where, speaking of the future, where do you plan to go in terms of your research? Is this something that you're going to continue to work on and develop, or are you moving into other areas at this point?
Um, no, it's always, I'm always looking at developing the research. I mean, for me, I feel like it's a lifetime project, and
Okay,
I can't ever really not imagine, doing this. And I'm interested in all types of different birth, really, and what that would mean astrologically and sociologically,
mm,
psychologically. Um, so yeah, I will continue to. I mean, I've been, put this into a PhD for many years, but it's not really about the PhD for me. It's about, well, it is in terms of taking it further. So that's why I have to complete the PhD. But for me, it's really about getting the work out there.
sure. And just
Yeah,
raising awareness about this as a phenomenon that's happening.
yeah, it is about raising awareness, particularly within the astrological community,
Sure.
because it's really the only, well, maybe not the only, but the only discipline, I guess, that I know that can highlight this particular, you know, phenomenon. So I'm interested in making it more aware. So that's the problem I have, whether I just publish everything
Right.
or continue to study. So which I probably will do
Hmm.
because it just tends to grow, and it's really important, I think, to get out there.
Have you ever gotten any like, pushback from astrologers or any debates about this of people, I don't know, objecting to any conclusions or?
Yeah, some people. I mean, there's some very strange. It's always sort of tied up with fate.
Okay.
Normally, and people have said, well, this is how society wishes to present itself.
Mm.
This is how it's the cosmic. How it's going to unfold. And like I said, I keep coming back to the lunch hours and the Friday afternoons, and I cannot believe that obstetricians' diaries are are an advocate for fate, because that's just doesn't make sense to me. I don't believe that that is the case, but a lot of astrologers believe that this is, if that's what's happening, then that's what's supposed to happen.
The idea that like everything happens for a reason or something like
Yeah,
that. Okay.
yeah, and it'll all be okay.
Mm.
And I'm not really of that. Yeah,
Whereas you feel like this is not necessarily this a not positive intervention of technology in society that's kind of messing up the even distribution of an otherwise natural phenomenon.
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely that. Yeah, yeah, this is intervention, and and that's exactly what it is. Um, and even if astrologers believe that fate. I mean, if that's the case, then there needs to be some thinking about, can fate be intervened then, if that's what people believe.
Sure.
Can fate be intervened with?
Yeah. I mean, I guess
Can
that's
you intervene with the gods, if you like? So
right. I guess that's been one of the questions with like electional astrology. Like, do you practice or do you believe in electional astrology yourself?
yes, definitely.
Okay.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and I use it myself, and yeah.
Yeah.
No, I do. Yes, definitely, because if and I lock my doors,
Hmm. Right.
and I don't walk at 2 o'clock in the morning in a dark street. If I lift things, I don't. I think it's important that there is a. If we believed that, then what is the point of having any free will? Then
Hmm.
there is no point.
Sure.
So I definitely believe in election. Yeah. Is that
Okay.
what you mean by that? Is
Yeah,
that,
yeah. I was just
or do you
curious.
mean it from the other side of it? Of
Like I
the
was trying to think of what the argument would be or how to frame it if there's some astrologers that say this is just the way that it is and this is where society is going and no matter what happens, even if there's intervention in the birth chart will still work and still be relevant because that was the chart the baby was supposed to have. Whereas it almost seems like you're saying that maybe you're concerned that this level of intervention might almost mess up the astrology or might.
No, I don't think that level of intervention messes up the astrology
Okay.
at all. And I do believe that every baby's chart, no matter how they're born,
Mhm.
is the chart. That's their chart.
Sure.
I definitely believe that. There are some people that don't believe, like a lot of people, well, not a lot, but, there's a few people that have said, I was late, or I was born premature.
Oh, right.
So this is when I was supposed to be born. And
Right.
it's like, well, you're born, there's nothing you can really do about that. And,
Right.
and no one would ever know exactly when you were supposed to be born. And it's not even worth going there, really. So, some people have different beliefs about birth and what, but some people also believe that babies are born, no matter how they're born at a time they're supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that sort of cuts into, well, it certainly challenges, I think, it should challenge people's beliefs on fate.
Sure.
So why have free will? Why,
Right.
if everything is happening? I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not that cynical in that, I do think things are interconnected. I do think, and I take, but I do think, there's a lot of personal responsibility that needs to be taken as well.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure there'll still occasionally be those funny stories where, like, the doctor got in like a car accident and was late that day, and so the delivery occurred at 5 p.m. that night instead of at 9 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah. Well, now in Brazil, there is a joke: is the only way you can have a natural birth is if you get stuck in traffic. It's a national joke.
Okay.
It's and how awful to have a baby, in a car in a traffic jam. There is going to be that. There's going to be, and natural childbirth will be seen as archaic.
Mm.
You can already see this generation not wanting to, have the same, I'm sure there's many that do, but there's also a large group, I think, a large majority who don't want to give birth.
Sure.
Naturally.
Well, it'll be interesting to see if that has an effect on the astrology and what effect it has and how astrologers cope with that in the future, let's say like a century from now.
Yeah, exactly.
So good luck.
Exactly.
Good luck, future astrologers.
Yeah. Good luck. We have an interesting client base,
Right.
There won't be much deviation between it, it'll be.
Yeah, no Pisces suns with Scorpio rising, I think you said, because that would be a night chart.
Yeah, it'd be like, oh my God, I had a third house sun today.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Yeah.
They were really chatty.
Yeah. They seem to talk much more than everybody else. Yeah,
Right.
Exactly. All these sort of, it is odd, but it like I said, it seems far-fetched, but actually, there's a lot of things that people thought were far-fetched 10 years ago that are already here, the technologies and stuff. So watch the space.
Yeah.
I think.
All right. Where can people find out more information about you and your work in astrology in general?
Well, you can, my website, which should be updated within the next 6 weeks, is wendystacey.com.
Okay.
And the school, which teaches and has webinars on the subject, specialised webinars, it's not part of the curriculum, is the Mayo School. So that's mayoastrology.com. If you want to support the organisation that supports astrology, then it's astrologicalassociation.com.
Brilliant.
So we have our annual conference and publications, the journal, online or hard copy. So
Yeah, the Astrological Association journal is amazing, and you guys have made digital versions of all of the back catalog available
it's
online.
all archived. It's fabulous. It's such a treasure.
Yeah,
treasure chest of knowledge.
That's amazing for research astrologers to have access to that as members.
Yeah. And for those interested in research, of course, we've got the archive of correlation as well, which, is really about quantitative research, and that which has been done over the last couple of decades, which is really interesting stuff.
Yeah, that's one of the few journals dedicated to sort of more scientific research in astrology.
Yeah.
And then finally, so the Astrological Association holds a yearly conference. You guys just did your last one last week, and it was amazing. Yeah. And so people that live in Europe or the UK or pretty much anywhere should just know that every year you'll have an annual conference sometime around this time of the year. Yeah,
June. Possibly we've just moved the last couple of years to June from September, which we had 49 conferences in September, or except the eclipse one in 99. which was in August. So we're trying out sort of spring summer conferences to see how they go. So to see how so next year we think it will be around the same time.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Well, people should definitely check that out. Thanks a lot for joining me today.
Thanks, Chris. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.